Hey guys, what's up? My name's Zach, and I'm here to make the final call on the presidential election of 2020 and later on the Senate as well. Alright, so there's a number of factors, obviously, to take in consideration for an election of this magnitude. One big thing that I'm going to be setting throughout this video is the mail-in voting. The fact that, half the vote essentially has been cast, or presumably has been cast by mail. We're dealing with what's really like 50% mail and 50% in person in all likelihood, if not just a little bit off from that, but probably pretty close to that general margin. So just to start out with the likely states, I'm going to be calling Nevada, New Mexico, Virginia. Actually, New Mexico will be solid. I'll explain why in a second. Virginia, Colorado, New Hampshire, and Maine's first should be solid. And Maine's 2 at large should be likely as well. Minnesota, I'll be calling likely for the Democrats. And so here's my justification for all those blue states. There's going to be more blue states other than that I'll be calling likely as well. But for these states, these are all states that were considered competitive in 2016, and these are states that Hillary Clinton won. We're now in a position right now when it comes to be it polling, be it the states just background in voting historically. These are all states that are very considerably likely to go to Biden, especially considering the fact that Biden right now is, by most metrics, doing better than Hillary did, polling-wise, fundraising-wise, than Hillary did in 2016. And just based on that logic alone, you can assume that these are states that Hillary won within 5 points or 10 points. It varies from state to state. But these are all states that Hillary Clinton won, despite the fact that she was at a disadvantage to Biden compared to how Biden is in 2016. And based on that logic by itself, that already makes these states likely blue. The other thing is obviously the polling data for each of these states have been pretty conclusively in Biden's favor. So for all those factors, I would list these states as likely blue. And now for the states that are going to be likely red, I would consider that to be Montana, Kansas, Alaska, and South Carolina as well, even though I felt that solid originally. Logic here, and Utah as well, I'll be filling in likely. Again, the logic here is that these are states that are pretty likely to go Trump either way. It's the same argument that I would make for the states that I just called. The fact that, I think it's the Senate races here as well that also play a big role. I mean, we have pretty competitive Senate races in Montana, Kansas, South Carolina, and in Alaska as well, I guess. That do shape the presidential election a little bit, to a degree where it really comes down to moderates and independents in these states, moderate Republicans and independent voters. And at the end of the day, I don't think it's going to be enough to shift anything. Out of these likely states, I would certainly say that South Carolina is the most likely to turn, just given the state's background, given how surprisingly close it was in the 2018 midterms, when you look at the House, and looking at how close it is between Jamie Harrison and Lindsey Graham in that state for the Senate. I'll be talking about that later when I cover the Senate race. But yeah, these are states that can be considered likely for Trump. Now going over to the rest of the states. These are the states that are really these are the important states essentially. The ones that you see in gray on the electoral map. These are the states that will be deciding the election, and these are the states I'll be putting the most time on. To start, I'll be calling Michigan likely for Biden. I know it's likely just the rest of them, but it's a different justification because this is a state that went to Trump in 2016, and despite that, I am putting it in the same column as I am Colorado, a state that Hillary Clinton won by 5+ points in 2016. And my logic here is one, that Biden is ahead in polling significantly more than Hillary was in this state in 2016. The margin is very noticeable between Hillary and Biden if we're talking about the polling difference between them and Trump. The other logic is that, there is the mentality that, Hillary did not put as much attention into the Rust Belt, these states, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, that she should have done in 2016. Obviously, that isn't the case now. Obviously, Democrats have learned their lesson very, very much so since then, and have poured in a ton of time and money into these three states. Whereas in 2016, they were thinking that states like Nevada or even Colorado would be more competitive than these states up here. And we know now that isn't the case. And I think that Biden is going. I think that Michigan is probably the only state that I'm willing to that went to Trump 2016 that I'm willing to now call likely for Biden. The rest of them, if I'm going to be flipping any states for Biden, are probably going to be leans. But just given Michigan's Democratic DNA, given the 2018 midterms as well, I'm going to be citing the 2018 midterms as a main factor just because it's the most recent benchmark that we can use in terms of statewide elections. This state is still pretty Democratic. Last election, there was a Republican incumbent governor. He was voted out. Actually, that could be wrong. I think it was just that the Democrat won there against a non-incumbent, but still, I would still consider this to be a Democratic state, and I don't think it's going to be going to Trump again this time around. Moving on from there, I believe the rest of the states I'll be calling will be leaning. I think we're out of the likely column at this point. I'm going to be calling Iowa leaning for Trump. And this, I think that every poll and every pundit group at this point has been listing Iowa as a pure toss-up. I am going to disagree with that call. This is because in 2018, we did see gains in the House. We did see gains in the House by the Democrats, and those gains are likely to be kept, not significantly likely, but likely in general to be kept this time around. But looking at the statewide election, there was a governor's race here that was given a lot of attention to. That governor's race ended up going 10 points in favor of the Republican incumbent. Look back at 2016. Trump won this state very handedly, much more so than anyone had anticipated beforehand. I believe he won Iowa by almost 10 points. I could be wrong about that, but it was definitely more than 5, which is kind of moving out of what should be considered toss-up territory. But Biden has made efforts in this area. Biden has made efforts in the Midwest in general. Him and Trump have topped off their campaigns this past week with spending a lot of time in the Midwest and in the Rust Belt. Despite that, I do think that Iowa is trending Republican. That doesn't match the general trend of the rest of the country. I think that Iowa is a bit of an exception there. And I do think that Iowa will be going to Trump this time around. Moving on to Georgia. Actually, I'm going to save Georgia for a little bit later. Wisconsin, yeah. I'm going to be calling Wisconsin leaning towards Biden. This is probably the most decisive, if not one of the top 3 most decisive states in this election so far. This is the state that, in many ways, cost Hillary Clinton the election in 2016. This is the state that both candidates have probably put a lot of time into. Pennsylvania is also up there. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Biden, this is can be paired with Michigan in the sense that there's been a noticeable difference between Biden's polling advantage over Trump compared to Hillary Clinton's polling advantage over Trump 2016. But I think it should be mentioned that the polling data in 2016 was pretty incomplete. And this goes back to what I was talking about before, the fact that Wisconsin was not considered to be a toss-up. It was barely considered to be a toss-up in 2016. Like I said, states like Nevada and Colorado were considered to be more competitive than Wisconsin. So as a result, there was a lack of polling data in this state compared to now, where there's a ton of polling data in this state for obvious reasons. And that polling data does have Biden ahead of Trump here. And we can look back at the 2018 midterms as well. There was a governor's race here. The Democrat won by a very slim margin. And I think that the state is lending back the Democrats' column overall, and I will be calling it pretty narrowly given, but I will be calling it for Biden. Now going over to Ohio. I will be calling Ohio leaning in Trump's column. This does go a little bit against polling data. Polling data and pundits would place this mostly as a tilt, aka a pure toss-up. I'm going to be calling it as a lean, and my logic here is that given the 2018 midterms, like that, my main lesson after spending all the time that I did analyzing the 2018 midterms, trying to predict it, and then reviewing where I went wrong, reviewing where I was right, my main lesson that I took from 2018 is that the country is just getting more and more polarized, that the red states are just getting redder, blue states are just getting bluer, and the more unpredictable states are getting more unpredictable. Ohio, even back then, has had a Republican tendency. Their state legislature has been dominated by Republicans. Their House of Representatives demographic has been dominated by Republicans. And in the 2018 midterms, although the incumbent Democratic senator here did win by a few points, There was a governor's race here that was far more competitive between, after John Kasich had resigned, there was no incumbency advantage for the Republicans. Despite that, the Republicans still won here by a pretty solid margin. I believe it was around 10 points. And given that election 2 years ago, and given this state's Republican DNA overall, which I do believe it does have, and given the margin that Trump won here in 2016, which was pretty solid, I will be calling it leaning towards Trump. Okay. Now going over to Pennsylvania. I will be calling Pennsylvania leaning as well, but and that does give Biden the victory, and I do believe that Biden's going to win the presidential election. But let me talk about Pennsylvania for a minute, just because this is likely going to be the deciding state of the whole election, if we're being real here. I don't think, obviously there's states like Florida, North Carolina, Arizona even, that could play a significant role in deciding the election, but I really feel like it's going to come down all to Pennsylvania. We've been seeing the polls narrow in the state in the past few days. We've been seeing it get closer. There's been polls that have been called in favor of Trump. There's been polls that have been called in favor of Biden, all within a few points of each other. Biden's lead in this state has slipped over the past few months from what it was. Biden used to have a very, very solid lead in this state. Now he does not. His lead is not nearly as good as it once was. Although, with that considered, I mean, it still is a lead regardless. It's a few points over Trump, and that does give Biden the polling advantage. Looking back at the 2018 midterms, there was a solid Democratic turnout here. The 2018 House of Representatives very strongly went in favor of the Democrats. There was a number of districts here that flipped. And I do think it's going to be probably one of the closest states of the leaning states. I think it could very easily end up in toss-up territory. I mean, it's the second, so I mean, there's only a certain amount of difference that time can make at this point. But I could be off. I am willing to concede that I could be off in calling the state leaning. I could very easily see it slipping in the toss-up territory. And if it does slip in the toss-up territory, Biden's in trouble, because this is the state that could decide everything. As in, if this state doesn't go to Biden, then I don't think that the odds of all these states going to Biden, or any one of these states going to Biden, especially, is likely. So this state, very, 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 very important. But moving on, I think we're moving into tilting states, aka the pure toss-ups. I would consider all these states... actually, no, Texas I'm going to call leaning. I'm going to call Texas leaning. I'm going to talk about why I'm a bit torn there in a minute. But yeah, Texas will be leaning towards Trump. There is a number of reasons why I shouldn't call this leaning and why I should call it tilting. Let's talk about that first. I mean, there's been a number of court cases decided in the state in the past few weeks, today including as well, that have made things very good for the Democrats in this state. Just today, there was a court ruling that decided against throwing out over 200,000 ballots cast in Harris County from being counted. Those ballots are going to be counted. That's big for the Democrats. Harris County is one of the areas that are trending rapidly blue. We can look at the 2018 midterms as well. Beto O'Rourke very much had a very narrow margin of a loss between Ted Cruz. I believe it was about 3 points. Hillary Clinton, even going back to 2016, was within 5 points in this state. We do see the margin between Democrats and Republicans in statewide races getting narrower and narrower, which does give Biden a lot of hope if that trend continues. Despite that, and despite those, and despite all the time and money the Democrats have poured in here as well, I think Democrats see Texas not just as a possibility for 2020, but as a huge possibility, as a long-term investment, really, for the future, because they know that once the Republicans lose Texas, they know that once this is the scenario, that they can lose states like they can lose the entire Rust Belt. I mean, not Pennsylvania, but they can lose the entire Rust Belt, keep Texas, and still win. That is huge for Democrats. I don't think that's happening now. I don't think this is a scenario that we're going to see happening at this point. But I do think that that's how Democrats see it. It's a long-term investment for future presidential elections and future midterms as well. For now, I don't think it's there. For now, I do think that Republicans are going to barely hold on to it this election. Obviously, mail-in voting is a factor for all these states. Like, a big reason why I'm calling Pennsylvania as well, just going back to Pennsylvania for a second, is the fact that mail-in voting was taking place over the past few months, and back when Biden was doing good in that state, back when Biden's lead was good. So considering the fact that half the votes been called before Election Day when polling was good for Biden, and then the other half is going to be called on Election Day when polling is still good for Biden, but not nearly as good. That's a big reason why this state is leaning and not tilting towards Biden at this point. The same argument can be made for Texas, except the other way around. I mean, Biden's just recently started to narrow polls in this state, and it could come down to Election Day versus the past few months, which have been still close, but not nearly as close as it needs to be for the state to flip. So, again, a lot to consider with Texas. It is certainly the more close of the leaning states, but I will be calling it leaning towards Trump. Nebraska. I need to call these two districts as well before it gets to the actual toss-ups. Nebraska, I'm going to be tilting that district in Omaha. I'm going to be calling for Biden. We're seeing this in the House as well. The polls for the House election here are pretty friendly towards Democrats. Biden has, I think a lot of Biden's efforts in Iowa will, if anything, manifest themselves in that district in Nebraska, which literally borders directly next to Iowa. It's just Omaha, the city. And I would call that, again, with districts, it's always difficult to call because you're talking about a population size of 200,000 versus, millions of people with some of these states. But I will be tilting it towards Biden. Actually, leaning towards Biden, rather. And Maine, I will be leaning towards Biden as well. We did see that district go to Trump, both these districts go to Trump in 2016. However, that district in Maine, we did see flip blue in 2018. And I think that Biden's been doing a much better job here than Hillary did in 2016. And I do think, and polls also give Biden an advantage in this district, if that's anything. And for those reasons, I would call it for Biden. Now, these states, these are the toss-ups. These are the states that I'm calling tilting. Could go one way or another. These are the states that I'm essentially the most uncertain of, and most people, I think, are most uncertain of. To start, I'm going to be calling Arizona tilting towards Biden. The only reason this state isn't leaning, which is what it's been in my predictions and other people's predictions for the past few months, or for almost the entire of the election season, polls have been very good for Biden. But they've started to narrow very much coming to Election Day. We're now seeing polls that have Trump ahead in this state. Same goes for the Senate race. Those polls are narrowing as well, which kind of just corroborates the presidential polls. But then you also have to consider mail-in voting. That half the vote was before that. Half the vote was when this state was friendly to Democrats and looking like it was going to go to Democrats. I think that that's a big factor, and that's a big reason why I'm calling it for the Democrats in general. But that Election Day turnout is significant, obviously. And I think that's going to be pushing this state from leaning Biden to tilting Biden. There is a possibility that the state could remain red. For now, it's looking good for Biden. Now, Georgia. I'm going to be calling Georgia tilting towards Trump. This state is, like Texas, it's a long-term investment for Democrats. This is a state that's likely going to be flipping in the next election cycle, if not this election cycle. There's a significant possibility, this state could flip. 2018, the governorship was just dead heat. There's still debate over whether or not the Republican actually won in that state. We're seeing in both Senate races in this state, dead heat. This state is a pure toss-up, which is, I think, more than Democrats were ever hoping for with this state. Going into this election cycle, I don't think that any Democrat really thought that Georgia was going to be a pure toss-up, and that's exactly what we're seeing now. We're seeing it a pure toss-up. We're seeing pundits calling it for Democrats. There's, I believe, Sabato's Crystal Ball has called Georgia for the Democrats already, which is pretty significant. I'm going to be disagreeing with that just based on past voting patterns. I don't think it's there yet. I just don't think it's there and ready to break that cycle. It could very well change. The polling data is so close in this state, and everything is so close in this state that could end up not being the case. But for now, I'm going to be tilting it towards Trump. If Democrats do win this state, that is huge for them. But this is one of the pure toss-ups I'm going to be calling narrowly for Trump. Same goes with North Carolina. I mean, Biden has had a pretty consistent semi-lead in the state over the past few months. We've been seeing polls narrow more and more so as time has gone on, right towards the end, up until now. Obviously, that's something that should be taken into consideration. But because of that early voting, and despite this state's past voting history, that's a big factor that's in the favor of Republicans. This state has tended to vote Republican for the past two election cycles. Despite that, I do think that the polling data from early on from the past few months does have Biden ahead. That's when half the vote was called. Compared to now when Biden only has a minor lead, but a lead regardless. He is leading in this state This state this state has gone Republican for a while, but only by a few points. I think that given the current circumstances, given the early voting, given the approval of the president as well, which is something that should be taken into consideration throughout the country, I'm going to call this state tilting towards Biden. Last but not least, Florida. Always the most unpredictable state, generally speaking, with any presidential election. I will be calling this state tilting towards Biden. This is another state that polls have narrowed very much so in the past few weeks. We've seen it become in dead heat. There's been a pretty equal number of polls that have been in Biden's favor and Trump's favor, all having them both like ahead by at most like 3 points in the past few weeks. And so, but for the past few months, Biden's been ahead here, and mail-in voting has been occurring for the past few months. That's a big factor in Biden's favor. Big factor in the Republicans' favor, however, is the 2018 midterms. This state did solidly reject, not solidly, I mean, it was very close, both for the Senate and for the governor's race, but Republicans were elected in both instances. One of them was an incumbent Democrat that was voted out over a Republican. So, as always, Florida is very unpredictable, could change on a dime. For now, it's looking friendly towards Biden. And this is the electoral map. We have Biden 335 electoral votes. We have Trump 203. So let's just, for argument's sake, explore the possibilities that this can change. Because we've all lived in scene 2016, and we know that can change very easily. So let's entertain those possibilities for a second. Let's say that Arizona flips, because that's probably one of the most likely states. Let's say that Arizona flips red. Let's say that all the states that are tilting blue right now go red. That's still a loss for Trump. He can win every single toss-up, essentially. All these states, Arizona, Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, he can win all of them and still lose. What it comes down to is Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. That's really what this entire election comes down to, is Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, just as it did in 2016. So if Trump wins Wisconsin, Biden still wins the election, and then it can really come down to these two electoral votes. Like if either one of these electoral votes flip, then it's just a tie and the House decides, or the whole country descends into chaos and there's rioting across the country. I think that's also an equal possibility. Honestly, I think an electoral tie would be the worst possible outcome of this election. An electoral tie would, I think, absolutely eviscerate the fabric of our government. But that aside, let's leave the possibility aside for a second. That'll be decided by these two little districts that can very easily go one way or another. Even if Trump wins in Wisconsin, I don't think that Biden still wins by 2 electoral votes. He has to win Pennsylvania. So, and what's the odds of him winning Pennsylvania? What's the odds of that happening? I believe that Trump's odds of winning Pennsylvania right now are about 30-20%. So, overall, my final call for the presidency is going to be Biden having about an 80% chance of winning. Trump's odds of winning are about 20%. That's the odds. Okay, now going over to the Senate race. First thing I'm going to be saying right off the bat is that very rarely does a Senate race in one state go one way in the Senate and then go another way for the presidency. That very rarely happens. Usually a state goes the same way it does for the presidency as it does for the Senate race. One of the most recent examples of an exception of that rule was in 2012 when Indiana went blue in the Senate and went red for the presidency. But that was an instance in which I believe the Republican challenger said some really horrible stuff about rape, I think, on a live radio show, and then lost by 10 points to the challenger. So instances like that, instances where there's some sort of big exception in the Senate race, is usually what causes, and in special Senate races as well, instances like in Georgia, where this Senate race is going to be in fact occurring after the election takes place. This is just the main primary where every single party candidate competes in a single election, and then after that is the actual election takes place, which doesn't occur until January, after the result of the election is presumably known. So that's worth taking into consideration as well. So bear that in mind as I'm calling these states. So I'm going to be calling New Mexico solid for the Democrats. I think I've spoken on that before. A lot of pundits have called it likely rather than solid. But given the fact that this is just New Mexico has been pretty solid blue for the past few election cycles and hasn't really trended too much off that. 2018 just confirmed that. I'm going to be calling it solid. I think there's a whole lot to say there. As for likely states, though, I'm going to be calling Minnesota likely blue, New Hampshire likely blue, Colorado likely blue, and yeah, those are the states I'm going to be calling likely blue. Colorado, a lot of places have been calling it leaning just because the Republicans do have an incumbency advantage here, but this state has trended so much blue, and the challenger here to the Republican is John Hickenlooper, the former governor, who left with a very solid approval and who's now challenging Cory Gardner for the Senate. I don't think that Cory Gardner stands a chance. I think that he honestly has the worst chance of any senator on this map so far. So I think that calling it likely is generous. I'm like 90% certain it's going to be going to the Democrats in the Senate, just given the context of the Senate race and given the background of the presidential election, which is almost certainly to go blue in the presidency as well. I'm going to be calling it likely in this instance. New Hampshire, there was a possibility early on in this state going red when there's talk of Governor Sununu, the Republican governor here, going and challenging the incumbent Democrat, but that didn't happen. Democrats have an incumbency advantage. The guy running here I don't believe is anybody significant or well-known, and for that reason, I'm going to be pairing it exactly what its odds are in the presidency, which is likely blue. Minnesota, Tina Smith won in her special election in 2018. Now she's running for a full term. Same goes for the presidency. I think that this race is just directly tied to whatever occurs in the presidency, and that is likely. I don't see this race going any way that the presidential race doesn't go. So same call there. Now going over to the likely Republican states. I'm going to be filling in Mississippi solid. I don't know why I filled it likely. There have been some pundits that have been saying Mississippi is likely, but honestly, I don't see that as being a big possibility. So Alabama will be likely red, Alaska likely red, Kentucky will be likely red as well, and I believe that's all the states will be calling likely red. So Alabama, we got Doug Jones down here. Those of you who know him probably know him from that 2017 special election against Roy Moore, who was accused of being a pedophile and of various sexual misconduct allegations, lost the election here in deep red Alabama to a Democrat by a very slim margin. Obviously, this state has very, 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 very deep Republican roots that almost everybody knows just some common sense that Alabama is just a very red state. And because of the nominee, I think that if the Attorney General was nominated instead of Tommy Tuberville, who is the candidate here. Jeff Sessions, that's the name I was thinking of. Jeff Sessions was nominated instead. This could have been closer just because there is conflict in Alabama over Jeff Sessions and his relationship with Donald Trump. That's not the case. Tommy Tuberville was nominated, the former football coach. Very well liked in this state. I don't see the incumbency advantage doing anything for the Democrats here. And in fact, the incumbency advantage is probably the only reason it's likely and not solid. So yes, very, very likely to go red, Alabama. Very, very likely to go red. Okay, now I think we can move over to leaning states. I'm going to be calling Kansas leaning towards the Republicans. And my mentality here is that, again, presidential election year, very unlikely for this state to go one way in the Senate race and another for the presidency. Those odds maybe were in place if Chris Kobach, who was that controversial big Trump supporter in the state who ran for the governor's race in Kansas and lost to the Democrat, which kind of shows the moderate nature of this state compared to being solidly Republican, or solidly Trump Republican rather. Chris Kobach attempted to run for that position, or for the nomination for Senate here, lost it to a more moderate, more traditional Republican for the Senate, and I think that pretty much cements it. I'm not calling it likely just because the candidate here, the Democratic candidate, is a former Republican, very centrist, and that could create a lot of crossover appeal. So it's going to be leaning, and the polling data also is a bit conflicted here. So it's going to be leaning towards the Republicans rather than likely, which could end up being the case. Now going over to Montana, that state's going to be leaning red as well. We do see a big advantage for Democrats in this state. We have the former governor running here against the incumbent Republican senator. The Democratic governor here, he was very well liked. He had a very solid approval despite the state being generally solid red. Steve Bullock, he's the Democratic governor, is now he's now termed out of the governor position, and now he's going for the Senate. I think there is a significant possibility of this state flipping, although, again, you have to consider the presidency. This state is likely to go to Trump for the presidency. Do I see it flipping likely for the presidency? Absolutely not. Do I think that things are different here for the Senate race because of the Democratic challenger? Of course. But given the polling data, which does show Senator Daines leading in this state over Bullock, and given the state's Republican DNA overall, I will be calling it leaning towards the Republicans, although we could very easily see a surprise here, depending on how much more well-liked Bullock is than what I'm assuming. Now going over to Michigan, that state's going to be leaning blue. This differs from the presidential race. I called Michigan likely blue for Joe Biden because of the Republican challenger here. John James is a African-American businessman who ran for the other Senate position against Debbie Stabenow in the last 2018 election and lost by a closer margin than people were anticipating. I believe it was about 5 points. He's hoping to get lucky here, but again, I think it does come down to the presidential race. It comes down to the fact that Biden is leading here, that Gary Peters, the incumbent Democrat, is leading here as well, and that this state is likely to go blue in both instances. So, but because of John James being, having that crossover appeal and potentially reaching out to more African American voters, I am moving it from likely to leaning. Although I do think it is pretty likely to go blue either way, be it the Senate or be it the presidency. Texas, I'm going to be calling leaning red as well. Pretty early for Texas. I honestly don't think it's going to be nearly as close for the Senate as it is in the presidency, just because the Democrat, they could have nominated somebody much better. I think that if Beto O'Rourke was running here, this state would honestly not be leaning red but leaning blue. I honestly think that Beto O'Rourke would have made the state leaning blue if he was the candidate here and he hadn't decided to run for president instead, which was, I think, idiotic on his part. But instead they get nominated just someone who's mostly just a generic Democrat with a military background, M.G. Hager. I think she's going to put up a fight here. I think it's going to be a narrow margin, but I think it's going to be exactly the same, if not larger margin for Republicans as it is for the presidency. I don't see this state going blue in the Senate and then not going blue for the presidency. That doesn't make sense to me given the current makeup of the Senate race. So for that reason, I'm calling it exactly the same as the presidency is, leaning red. Okay. Now going over to these, I think we're getting into toss-up territory now. I'll be calling South Carolina leaning red. We've been seeing this state get narrower and narrower and narrower as time has gone on. It's gone from solid red, likely red, to now leaning red a day before Election Day. Jamie Harrison has put up a very good fight against Lindsey Graham. I think Lindsey Graham has had a very bad Senate record. People see how conflicted he is between supporting Trump and not supporting Trump, and that has dissatisfied his base. That has dissatisfied the Trump supporting base that Republicans rely on to win elections. Despite that, he is an incumbent with a huge fundraising advantage. He's got a war chest here in South Carolina. Despite that, Jamie Harrison has had pretty good fundraising records here in the state and has narrowed it pretty significantly. I think it's going to be close. I think it's going to be a lot closer than the presidency, honestly, which is why I'm calling it leaning for the Senate rather than likely as it is in the presidency. I think that Jamie Harrison could very easily put up a decent fight here. Now going over to Arizona. Again, like the presidency, this state has narrowed more so in the Republicans' favor over the past few weeks. We've been seeing this be pretty likely for Mark Kelly, the astronaut and gun support advocate running here. We've been seeing it very good. His odds have been pretty good in the state up until pretty recently when the polls have started to narrow and Martha McSally has started to make a little bit of a comeback. Despite that, early voting is a factor for the Senate as well. Those votes were cast before, and I do think that Mark Kelly is still leading the polls and still has an advantage here, to the point that I'm willing to call it leaning rather than tilting in Mark Kelly's column. I think that's the next most logical thing to call this state as is tilting, but given all those factors, I'm going to be calling it leaning instead. Okay. I'm going to be calling... Now, Iowa, I'm going to be talking about in a minute. Maine, I'm going to be calling leaning for the Democrats. We've seen this, and that's a flip as well. That's the second, or the third flip, I guess, after Arizona, since that's also a Senate race that's flipping. Susan Collins has been in this position up here for decades. She's been the Republican incumbent in Maine for a very, very long time. But I think what we've been seeing is that she's been struggling to maintain a moderate centrist record, which kind of just balances between alienating her Trump-supporting base, or the Republican Trump-supporting base overall, alienating them while trying to make inroads with more independents and more moderates and maybe centrist Democrats as well. I don't think it's been working out for her. I think her vote for Brett Kavanaugh was one of the big death knells for her. I think she came to her senses with Amy Coney Barrett voting against her because she sees how risky she is here, and I think that if she had voted for Amy Coney Barrett, this would have been like a deadlock for the Democrats, pretty much. But despite that, I don't think that pandering to centrists is working for her. I don't think she can win without that solid backing of Trump supporters, and I think she took a big risk by going against them. I don't envy her position. I don't envy any any centrist Republican, because they're forced to compromise between the Trump supporting base and just moderate independents in general, and there's really no easy way to reconcile those two groups, and I think that she's failed in doing so, and as a result, I think that she's going to lose. That on top of the polling records, polling in the state has also been pretty solidly for the Democratic candidate. That's also a big consideration. For that reason, it's going to be leaning towards the Democrats. Okay, now I think we're getting into tilting territory, pure toss-up. Iowa, I will be calling tilting towards the Republicans. This being tilting rather than leaning as it is in the presidency. And my logic there is that the Senate race is closer here. The Senate race is closer. We do see there a Democratic challenger having a narrower margin over Joni Ernst, the Republican incumbent here. Again, I don't think the odds are great for a Democrat to win here when they're in the Senate when they're also losing in the presidency, which is how I have it in my other prediction. But I do think it's a possibility, and I do think it's more so a toss-up here than it is in the presidency. And that really mostly comes down to polling data, more so than anything else, because all the other factors are pretty similar. But for that reason, I will be calling it tilting towards the Republicans rather than leaning as it is for the presidency. North Carolina, polls have been everywhere over the past few weeks, but I will be calling it tilting towards the Democrats, which, assuming that the Democrats win the presidency like I have predicted in my other prediction, would give them a majority as a result of the vice presidential factor over the Republicans and taking the majority from the Republicans. My logic with North Carolina is that Cal Cunningham has been leading in the polls fairly consistently since day one. Those polls have narrowed recently, but that's still a lead regardless. Fundraising advantage for Cal Cunningham as well. In the state, there's been a number of scandals both for Tom Tillis and for Cal Cunningham over the past few weeks that have made this a bit more divisive. In fact, just as divisive as the presidency. So it mostly comes down to the presidential factor. I do think that Biden's going to win the state very narrowly for the presidency, and for that reason, I feel obligated to call it that way for the Senate as well, just because it's as I was talking about before. And as I've been talking about for this entire prediction, the fact that it's very rare and very unheard of for states to go one way in the presidency and one way in the Senate. Just that in and of itself, there's not a whole lot in this race to make it stand out as an exception. I will be giving it the same call as I did for the presidency. Now going over to Georgia. These two Senate races, I think, are both toss-ups in their own right. For the one at large, between David Perdue, the incumbent, and Jon Ossoff, the challenger, I will be calling it tilting towards the Republicans. Jon Ossoff has put up a really good fight in this state for a race that was originally considered to be pretty solid for the Republicans initially, has become very much a toss-up as the presidency has trended that way as well. But I'm going to be calling it the same, giving it the same call as I did for the presidency, which is tilting red rather than tilting blue. And this is because, unlike this Senate race, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, this is this is one of those exceptions I was talking about, that special Senate race. This is going to be held on the same day as Election Day. It's the same exact voting patterns as the presidency. There's no real reason to think it's going to be going a significantly different direction for the presidency than it's going to be going for the Senate. So based on those factors alone, and although Jon Ossoff has been leading in the polls fairly recently, I think it's pretty split at this point, but there has been a minor lead. Despite that, I will be calling it the same as the presidency, just given those factors and given the fact that, like I was saying before, I don't think Georgia is quite ready to flip as it is. However, for this special Senate race, I will be calling it tilting blue, and this is my logic for that, which separates it from the state at large. Right now, we're seeing just a massive primary in the state in which Republicans and Democrats are running alike. We have Raphael Warnock, who has been consistently leading as a Democrat in this state against Doug Collins and Kelly Loeffler, both Republicans who I think both have a pretty equal chance in terms of polling and fundraising to win. Which one of them comes out on top, I'm not sure. That obviously will play a role in the actual election, which takes place a month after from Election Day. So a number of things, there's a number of assumptions that have to be made when calling this. I'm assuming that my prior prediction is correct. I'm assuming that my prior prediction is matching with this one. So this election would take place after, in a hypothetical scenario, that Biden would win. So after Biden would win in this state, I think that if anything, that would help out Democrats more so, given a Biden victory. And given the fact that Raphael Warnock is likely to win in the jungle primary immediately just because of how split it is between the two Republicans at this point, a victory I think is likely in the primary, but not as likely overall for the main race. But I will be calling this tilting towards Democrats just because we have a whole other month until the actual Senate race occurs, and I think that if the Democrats are the ruling party, as I have predicted in the presidency and in the Senate, even if this doesn't go to the Democrats, Republicans will still hold a technical majority as a result, and I think that will help them and allow them to win this Senate seat later on. So overall, my call is 51 Democrats and 49 Republicans. Democrats take the majority and increase their overall count in the Senate by, I believe, 4 seats. So let's explore the possibilities, as I did with the last one of the alternative scenario, the Republicans winning. Obviously, the Senate race that I was just talking about can very easily go a different direction. My logic can very easily be flawed there, understandably so, because there's a lot of assumptions that go into that, given the time between now and then. If that happens, it's a 50-50 split. Let's say they win the other Democratic toss-up, North Carolina. That's also a likely scenario. Then Republicans would keep the Senate. They would keep the Senate, and that would be that. But the odds of that happening, the odds of them winning both this special Senate race and that's pretty slim. I think that Democrats are going to be winning at least one of these, likely more North Carolina. And I think if anything, it's more likely that, and you also have to consider Iowa and the Georgia at large, these two areas that are at risk to go into to the Democrats as well. So overall, given those factors and given the probability of all those different outcomes, I would say that the Democrats' likelihood of winning the Senate is about 65% at this point. I'm going to be saying 65% at this point. I do think could very easily end up being the Republicans in their favor, but because of because of the 80% likelihood that I've given Biden for winning the presidency, given the fact that victory would allow them to have that tie-breaking majority, it is in the Democrats' favor to hold the majority because of the presidency, because the vice president would allow them to have a 50-50 split and still hold a majority. So given that, I think the Democrats' odds of holding majority in the Senate directly tied to the presidency is 60%. Okay, so that's the complete prediction for both the presidency and the Senate, and this is my final prediction for 2020. I understand that I haven't made a lot of videos on this over the past few months, not nearly as much as I did for the midterms. It's been a number of reasons. COVID has been a big reason for me. College has been a big reason for me. I've had a lot of chaos regarding college. I've been trying to get something going on Twitch. Hopefully I'll have that get going in the next few weeks, and I can start posting things regarding Twitch on this channel as well, is what I'm also looking forward to. Election predictions are not off the table for me. I will still be incorporating them, and I still do enjoy doing them, just not as often as election and political commentary. But we'll see. This channel is not dead. This channel is not dead, I guess is the number one message that I'm trying to convey. I will be doing more stuff, and I will be doing more for this channel. I just wanted to do this because it felt appropriate for me to do one final election prediction before 2020. I wouldn't have felt right, honestly, not doing one at all right towards the end. Alright, so thank you guys so much for watching. If you stuck around through the whole video, good job. I understand there was a lot of content. I understand you might have just stuck around for the presidency or maybe just the Senate, but thank you for watching, and have a good one.